You strong.
Then he raised his phone to read and said, compared to the previous levels, this level is really not as simple as joking. On the phone screen was a notification. Do you want to try again? The remaining chance is 10, yes or no? He immediately pressed the word yes. In his head he said, one more time. What followed was his countless failures and retries. The system failed. Do you want to try again? The remaining chances are 9, he said in his head again. The system displayed a notification again. Do you want to try again? The remaining chance is 8, but then he also failed. He continued to cheer himself. This time it will definitely work. And then the system appeared again. Do you want to try again? The remaining chance is 6, the remaining chance is 5. He still tried to try. In his head he said, there is still a chance. Then he continued to fail, so he tried again and again until the last try. And fortunately, in the end the system no longer appeared a failure message but a longer message. You have completed the test for the 5th subject, Spirit, you have finally passed. Challenge, he was now sitting on the ground panting tiredly. The system announced again that the test for the next subject will be held in 3 days, and the system is calculating the scores. He stood up, brushed the dust off his butt and thought, until finally he could resist the temptation of hell's arrogance. The virtual advisor hovering in front of him stammered in disbelief, asking, how, what? But you passed level 5. He calmly replied, I just endured it. I thought maybe my steadfastness and unmoved mind had improved a lot. He put his hands on his hips and looked at him with an incredulous face and said, I mean just in such a short time, how much progress can you make? How much progress has your steadfast, unmoved teaching made? He answered, right now it's at 31.7%. You spoke up, can you say it again? He answered, 31.7%. He silently said, no. Then you said like you were shouting, nonsense, no, wasn't it only at 15.5 last time I saw you? You managed to increase it another 16.2% in such a short time. He looked at him and replied, yes, let's do it like that. He didn't believe it and grabbed the phone from his hand and shouted, show me, 100 hearings are better than seeing. The system shows up. Professor Gautama's lecture progress is 31.7%. Merlin's lecture progress is 61.9%. Trong Tam Phan's lecture progress is 24.9%. Hercule's lecture progress was 53.7%. The lecture was completed. S, M, D, M, a star, transformed A. He read the system board in disbelief and gasped. He covered his mouth with his hand and said, yes, is it true? Oh my God, how could something like this happen? Then he suddenly spoke loudly, wait, paused for about 2 seconds, what's going on with the progress of Hercule's lecture? He heard him ask and calmly replied, that's probably it. It's just luck. He held the phone in both hands, turned back to look at him with a scary face and said, how lucky, what kind of unlucky luck did you have to be able to increase your team so much? Are you kidding me? I saw your scary face and swallowed and said, gulp, that expression of yours hurt me a bit. He couldn't keep calm and shouted, my expression was as strange as the numbers, meaning, not counting all the other lectures, how could he increase the progress of Duk's lecture? Buddha is that fast, not all new cadets have this level of progress, you know. He stood there and endured the wave of questioning, covering his ears and screaming, Then he answered his questions with a gentle sentence, that's also because I was lucky. When he heard his answer, his whole body became quieter, his face distorted completely. At this time, the system displayed a score notification. Cadet Kim SeoJoon's morale score was 22.8 points plus the previous 13 points. He received the score as expected and shouted happily, delicious. He was next to me, speechless, not knowing what to say. A few days later, they finally informed me of the results. Kim SeoJoon's test score, combat proficiency, 8.8 out of 100, failed, basic endurance, 5.9 out of 100, failed, reaction speed, 4.2 out of 100, failed, mana 1.6 out of 100, failed, spirit 22.8 out of 100, failed, use of primary weapon, spear, 5.8 out of 100, failed, proficiency proficient in elementary weapons, spear, 3.1 out of 100, failed, total score is 52.2 points. He saw his score and had a happy face, clenched his fists and smiled, saying loudly, once he did it. The virtual advisor on his shoulder also read his score and opened his mouth in surprise. He somehow analyzed his score in his head. His goal was to increase it by 70%, but instead he actually increased it by 80%, from 29 to 52 points. Second, it was an 80% increase. In other words, it was equivalent to an 80% discount coupon. I can finally listen to Chi Tian Dai Tan's lecture. My score increased 80%, which means I can finally take Chi Tian Dai Tan's class. If it weren't for my healthy heart, I would have fainted, Kim SeoJoon thought, clutching his heart and breathing. The advisor was next to him, his face in disbelief, his head filled with question marks, saying, "No way, how? You were absent-mindedly babbling, something like this happened." Suddenly he called out to you, "Hey," you were absent-minded when you heard him calling and immediately returned to his previous appearance and replied, "It's me." He sat on the chair and pointed at the phone and asked, "I was just curious, how many points do I have to get to not fail?" He answered, "Well, you just need to get over 60 points in each subject. But even if your total score exceeds the standard score, if just one subject is below 60 points, you will fail immediately." He immediately asked again, "So in short, how many points do I need to pass?" Cao raised his hand to rub his chin and said, "It depends, but usually it has to be over 90 points. In other words, the total score must be 630 or more." When he heard that, he opened his eyes wide and repeated, 630 points. Then he looked at his total score of 52 and 2 points sadly. He sat in a daze and said, "It's gone." The surroundings suddenly became as gloomy as his mood. Then he searched for Chi Tian Dai Tan's course on his phone. The boy next to him looked at him and asked, "Are you going to take Tai Tian Dai Tan's class too?" He answered with an eager face, "Yes, because I haven't decided which other class I want to take." The system pops up the course. The first course is Introductory Spear and Staff Techniques, Deception, Blocking, Stabbing. The teacher is Chi Tian Dai Tan. The second course is Peak Sand Sky Flow Star Staff Technique. The teacher was Chi Tian Dai Tan. When he saw two courses appear, he made a confused noise. He stared at the phone and rubbed his chin thinking, "I wonder how much it costs to learn the Meteor Scepter technique. No matter how expensive it is, I will still be able to register with my 80% discount coupon, right? Should I check it out?" Then click on the course P Tian Ling Lu Tin Trong Fop. The teacher is Tai Tian Dai Tan. The system displayed an error message. To participate in this class, you need to have the special skill Chi Tian Dai Tan, dribbling, blocking, stabbing, S level. When he saw that, he immediately exclaimed, "Ah." Then he scratched his head and thought with difficulty, "One day I will definitely be able to learn the Meteor Staff technique." Then he thought, "Well, let's learn what I can learn first," and in the end I chose that course, the course of Basic Techniques and Techniques, Deception, Blocking, Stabbing. The teacher was Chi Tian Dai. Street. The system displays a notification, calculating the appropriate cause and effect ratio and tuition level. Tuition is 5,400,000,000, reduced by 80%. Do you want to sign up for this class? After completing the lesson, you will receive the great technique Chi Tian Dai Tan, dribble, block, stab, level S, register. He sat there reading the announcement over and over again. Next to him, he was also looking at his phone. He read the amount over and over again without believing in his eyes. His whole body seemed numb, his hand holding the phone trembling as he thought, 5,400,000,001. You are next to him, arms crossed, and said, "The tuition is much cheaper." Already. He felt sad when he heard that. He tried to console himself and accepted the tuition, thinking, "Yes, at least it's not 27 billion. He then immediately pressed the registration button and the system immediately appeared. Registered successfully. And the button to start the video and the text press to play appears. The phone call showed a majestic mountain scene, combined with a clear blue sky and fresh light, but the strange thing was that Chi Tian Dai Tan was nowhere to be seen, so he inexplicably called out, "Hey." Seeing that, he immediately patted the phone with his hand and said in confusion, "The system is frozen, it's my 5.4 billion activity." At this moment, a face suddenly appeared on the phone and said, "I'm sorry." And the next image is the scene of the person in the video flying towards the clouds. He was startled by what he saw. It turned out to be Chi Tian Dai Tan. He flew quickly from a faraway place to the majestic mountain where the video started. After he landed, he opened his mouth and grinned and said, "Am I late? I have to go for a while because Master Tang Tang has something to call me." Master Tripitaka, in his words is also known as Duong Tang, is a famous character based on the Tang Sanzang prototype, a famous monk of the Tang dynasty, who went to India to request sutras and was protected by Sun Wukong, Pigzi, and Satang. He then turned from a happy face to a frowning face when he mentioned Tang Tang. He said angrily, "Anyway, that old master couldn't do anything himself, he was no different from a child. Even if it weren't for Buddha Tathagata, I would have taught him a lesson." Buddha Tathagata in his story is also known as Buddha Shakyamuni. Shakyamuni is his tribe. Muni is a Sanskrit word used to call saints or just wise people. When he saw Chi Tian Dai Tan, His whole face exuded happiness. Looking at him in the video, I thought, he really is Chi Tian Dai Tan. Hey, then laughed with satisfaction, ha ha. He then was so happy that he shouted in his heart, I was finally taught by him, and he was in the video right now with one hand on his hip, the other hand holding the stick he wanted on his shoulder, she said to him with a smile and a bright face. Anyway, I'm sorry for being late, but don't worry, I will definitely teach you properly. By the way, today I will teach you the basic techniques of spear and staff, deception, blocking, stabbing. I already explained deception, blocking, stabbing in the previous session, right? Mentioning spear and staff. Then he raised 3 fingers. Heaven said I have 3 forms. All the spear and staff techniques came from there. He was rubbing his chin and closing his eyes as he spoke, when he suddenly opened one eye and made an incomprehensible sound. Then he sighed and said, it seems this kid has forgotten. When he heard what he said hit his heart, he let out a panicked sound. He then took down the stick and said, I can't blame you, because it's my fault for being late, so I'll show you one more time. You should open your eyes wide and look carefully. When you hear that, immediately listen attentively. As soon as he finished the above sentence, he immediately started the lecture. First is deception, this is the deception movement, he said and followed along so that I could visualize. After his action, there was a shockwave, and the surrounding rocks and soil flew up everywhere because of his action. He saw the first move, rubbed his chin and exclaimed. The second time he saw this move and it was still real, he said in the video that he started the next move, the second was blocking. This movement points the stick inward. As he spoke, he held the stick with one hand and brought it back, with the other hand straight forward to make a blocking gesture. The next move he performed caused the mountain in front to be crushed. The mountain, after being crushed, fell to the ground. The subsequent shock caused smoke and dust to fly. When it came to the last move, his face became scary, he grinned strangely and said, the third is stabbing. Use the stick to hit as if you were penetrating a single point. Both said and done, this last move is really very strong. It can be said to be the strongest of the 3 moves he learned. The surrounding rocks are not, it simply flies away, but even carries very strong damage if encountered. After finishing the process of explaining and practicing those 3 moves to him, he immediately placed his stick on the ground and said, these are the most basic spear and stick skills, dribbling, blocking, stabbing. He stood in the middle of the desolate scene after his last 3 moves and spoke, if you want to learn from my meteor staff, you must master these moves first. Then he stood up straight, his hands on his hips, his hand holding the cane as if leaning on the ground, looking at him and saying, these moves are not only used for Lu Tin Trong, but are also required if you want to learn spear skills and other staff skills. So remember what I just taught you and practice bluffing until the next lesson. As soon as he finished speaking, he immediately ended the lesson. He was listening attentively when he was surprised because as soon as he finished speaking, he immediately finished. Push now. Then the system displays a notification, your personal task has been assigned, perform the wonderful performance of Chi Tian Dai Tan, swing the stick 1,000 times, the task will change according to the progress of the learning process. He looked at the assigned task and lamented, how could he do this? The boy next to him also watched Chi Tian Dai Tan teach, and when he heard him complain, he immediately spoke up, that's right, from the beginning until now, he has been taking the basic class for beginners, but starting from the intermediate class, his classes will be considered super classes, that's why the tuition is expensive. He heard what he said and immediately raised his head to look at him wonderingly, what is it, what's the difference? Each other. He replied, this is a completely different level. He looked at him confused and said nothing. It seemed like it was difficult to understand everything in words, so he immediately said that he could feel it better. Hearing that, he took out his weapon, stood up and went to the front yard to practice. He held the stick in his hand, remembered his movements and followed suit, asking if he was doing this right. He immediately tried the first move a few times. Then he did it for real and swung it really hard. He was then surprised that he could do it, so he exclaimed in surprise. Following his actions was the scene of flying rocks and soil like he had just tried to show him. His weapon immediately glowed. He was surprised and stood still without saying anything. Then he looked at the surroundings that had been devastated by his attack and said in disbelief, what the heck? He was next to him, his face was incredibly pale, but he said excitedly, I told you so. Then he immediately got out of his unbelievable feeling and suddenly let out a loud, whooshing exclamation. Scene changed to a certain wooden door. Behind that door is a room in the style of ancient kings. Inside the room there are 3 people, 2 men and a woman, sitting and drinking at a large table, placed in the middle of the room. The woman's name is Cha Hyen, a representative of Ale Academy. She is currently frowning slightly, not knowing what to say. The man sitting next to her is folding his arms, closing his eyes and frowning as if thinking about something, is Lee Jin-song. He is the representative of Gaon Academy. Opposite the two people is So Jin-hyun. He is the representative of Hunter Mills Academy. He is currently closing his eyes and enjoying the glass of water in his hand. Then he put the glass of water down on the table and spoke. Recently the situation of our top 3 Hunter Academy is not very good. People say that all 3 of our academies combined are not as good as a Dream Academy. Jin-song heard him say that and opened his mouth to say loudly, "So what do you think we should do? I mean, we should do something with Kim SeoJoon." He saw that Jin-song seemed to have misunderstood him, so he immediately spoke up to explain, "What are you talking about? I mean, we have to at least destroy his will to fight." Jin-song immediately heard him say that. Scowling and saying loudly, "Are you crazy? That bastard has a sword saint protecting him. Don't you know that if something goes wrong, not only you but also the Il's hunter can disappear?" Cha Hai-ain heard Jin-song say that, crossed his arms, closed his eyes and nodded in agreement with what Jin-song said. Suddenly Lee Jin-song stood up from his chair, grabbed his jacket and said, "I'll pretend I didn't hear anything." She saw him stand up and leave, so she also slowly stood up with her hand on the table and said, "Then I'm going too." Only Jin-hyun was still sitting at the table, watching the backs of the two leaving, breathing lightly. Then Jin-hyun spoke up and said goodbye. The two people who were walking heard that and stopped at the same time. They both turned around to look at Jin-hyun and heard him say, "No, the friendly tournament was about to be held later." She looked at him with wide eyes and asked, "Don't tell me, are you thinking of sending Lee Hae-eun?" Hearing her question, he smiled strangely. Then his whole face became scary. He spoke in a strange tone, "What do you two think?" After Kim SeoJoon tried to practice the technique that Tae Tien Dai Tan taught, his surroundings became a pile of ruins. He stood there in bewilderment and exclaimed, "It's impossible, everything was ruined in just one shot. Basic swing path." He suddenly sat down on the ground to rest, as if the power of a god was emitted while swinging the stick. He sat there tiredly speaking. This move consumed a lot of energy. The virtual advisor next to him heard that and said, "Of course, after all, the curriculum of Tae Tien Dai Tan is intermediate level." He had participated in a beginner's strength transcendence lesson which, in other words, was beyond his limits. Currently, Kim SeoJoon, of course, has no other choice but to fight. He sat there with a tired body, speaking with difficulty. Participating in a high-level class is not always good, right? Then he laughed again. He, of course, we didn't design the course arbitrarily." Hearing that, he raised his head to look at him. He sighed tiredly and thought, "Sigh, at this rate it will be difficult to try 10 times, let alone 1,000. The boy next to him saw that and immediately spoke up to encourage him, "It's okay, you don't need to do that. If it was beyond your ability, I would have stopped you from participating." Hearing that, he was surprised and asked, "Is there another way?" Then he put his chin on his hands and smiled brightly, saying, "Aren't you also planning to attend the Mana lesson? Because Mr. Kim SeoJoon is making great progress in his lessons with Hercules. If he studies in parallel with the Mana course, he will be able to achieve his goal." When he heard that, his face brightened and he raised his hand. Raised a voice. He then went to find a bench, brought it to the old place and set it down. "When you're done, stand up straight and brush your hands with a hum." Then he looked up at him and asked, "Before you said I should prioritize learning how to maintain stability, then train energy, and if it's effective, then train mana, right?" He immediately replied, "That's right, you have to choose based on your preferences. In theory, it's okay, it's right on the topic, you should listen to it." I listened to you while looking at the phone thinking, "Should I listen to it?" The system immediately appeared with courses for him to choose from. The first steps leading to ascension, weapon training. The instructor was Trong Tam Phon, Broken Heart Complete Version, Escape from Heaven. The guiding swordsman is Lu Dongbin. The Roundtable Conference is full of the secrets of knights and the wisdom of Merlin. The instructor is Arthur Pendragon. The power is boiling like a dragon, the aura of a dragon. The instructor is led by Siegfried. To explain a bit, Trong Tam Phon mentioned a legendary Chinese Taoist who is widely believed to have created Tai Chi. Lu Dongbin was a scholar and said to have lived during the Tang dynasty. He is widely known as one of the early masters of alchemy. Arthur Pendragon, King Arthur is the legendary king of England. Sigurd or Siegfried is a legendary hero in the legends of ancient Germans, who killed the dragon. In Old Norse was Fafnir. The image of a certain saint appeared on the phone. He was wearing Tang dynasty clothes, had a sword strapped to his back, and was holding a small whisk in his hand as he spoke. He also practiced weapon training. Like expanding a bowl. And that bowl is likened to the dandine, also known as acupuncture points. To explain a little, the dandine has an upper, middle and lower, which are the 3 energy centers of the dandine. The upper part focuses on the brain, the lower part focuses on the brain. Concentration is concentrated in the heart, while the lower part is below the navel, and that saint is La Dong Tan, a sword master. He looked at the phone, heard him talk about Dantian, and immediately analyzed it in his mind. So, if you understand that, then Dantian is the most important part of the body, and Dantian is determined to have three main parts. Lu Dong Tan on the phone continued to explain, upper Dan, middle Dan, and lower Dan. He said as he slapped the dustpan on his palm. First, Tianj Dan refers to the spiritual world of the student. Entering a state of meditation means having to learn about Taoism and its laws. Related, to put it simply, it is the ultimate goal to lead to the transcendent realm, or in other words, the upper elixir can turn mortals into gods, through the process of leveling up. It is located in the center at the top of the nunneries area, he said while pointing the dustpan at the exact location he said. He then immediately concluded that among the three Dantians, the upper Dantian is the most important. However, unfortunately in this lesson, we will not mention the upper Dantian area. He sat on the chair listening to his lecture but was confused and said, "Wow, what did he say?" Then he scratched his head and thought clearly, "I don't really understand, but I have grasped a few main ideas, maybe it's because of Merlin's lesson." He then raised his hand and rubbed his chin to analyze. A part of the body is called Nu Quan Thong, also known as the brain, so because the brain is an important part of the upper body, it is also called the brain. Mind. The upper area is the brain, the middle area is the heart, and the lower area is the abdomen. So, to summarize Master La Dong Tan's cultivation lesson, compared to mana training, when cultivating, the amount of energy in the body will gradually increase. To accumulate this amount of energy is quite easy, but it takes time. If you want to be safe, you must practice Qi. If you want to be effective and safe, choose to practice Qi. So that was his idea. The virtual advisor next to him immediately spoke up to explain further, the lesson to help you use it purely. Mastering magic is refining energy and training mana. If you want to be safe, use training weapons. If you want to be effective, choose training mana. Then he suddenly discovered something and gasped. He was talking to himself in his head, something appeared, the system displayed a notification, the power was boiling like a dragon, the aura of a dragon, the instructor was Siegfried. On the phone, an image of a muscular dark-skinned man with white hair appeared on the phone, with his hands on his hips. The words dragon's aura appeared above. He asked in confusion, "What is that?" The screen changed again, showing an information board, which happened to good students, with the search keyword being Mana Lecture. The results found 945 comments. What do I have to do to participate? Mana's lecture, or was he planning to attend the lecture? There was also a lecture recommendation. He read the words on the phone but couldn't understand and said, that's strange. Then he rubbed his chin, closed his eyes, and wondered, did I misunderstand something? The virtual advisor next to him immediately asked him, what's going on? He immediately turned to look at him and said, Advisor, I have something to ask. When he heard that, he immediately responded enthusiastically, what's the matter? He asked, I can't attend 2 lectures at the same time, right? When he heard me ask, he exclaimed in confusion, huh? He explained that according to Master La Dong Tan, the upper Dan is the area of the brain, so doesn't that mean that Buddha Shakyamuni's steadfast mind sermon can play the same role as the upper Dan? After listening, he immediately answered, and this steadfast mind is something that must be learned in the transcendental course. It can also be said that all the transcendental practitioners have learned alchemy by themselves using a steadfast heart of Buddha Shakyamuni, so whether you are a middle Dan or a lower Dan, if you attend the Mana lecture, you can use the 2 main parts of the Dantian at the same time. I will ask if you hear your answer. Next, then that means using all 3 upper, middle and lower parts of the Dantian is not impossible, right? He heard his question and scratched his head and asked again, can you do that again? He immediately asked again, isn't that possible? He rubbed his chin and said, I don't know very well. I don't know the details just by looking at the content of the lecture. So while he was listening intently to what he said, he discovered that his phone had a notification. The notification said that Merlin's lecture progress speed was plus 16.2%, for a total of 78.1%. He looked at the notification and thought, Merlin's lecture comprehension process speed had increased. I must have it. Then he turned to look at him, clasped his hands firmly and asked, on the other hand, did the students he had been in charge of say anything? He replied, yes, they just chose based on their interests. Prefer. But if by now there's still no exception, then isn't it ineffective? He said, can you ask the guide? He spoke up, the guide. He immediately replied, yes, I wanted to ask the inflammatory community but there was nothing on the notice board. Then he looked at him seriously and asked, Wouldn't it be more accurate to ask directly the instructors involved? Is it because it was a free online lecture and not from a professional instructor? Or do I have to spend money again? Hearing that, he stammered and said, "No, that's not it." Without letting him finish explaining, he brought his scary face closer to him and said, "Students always ask about the content of the lecture, right? Seeing him like that made his head sweat. A sound. Then his face smiled, he gave me a thumbs up and said I'll ask. Once he received the appropriate answer, he immediately stood up and left. As he walked, he put his hands in his pockets and thought, it would be great if I had you can learn both, but the problem is money. It's a matter of money again. Hick. Thinking about this, his face immediately became scary, his wide eyes and frowning eyebrows clearly showed his unwillingness. He went to a certain office, opened the door and walked in while talking to himself. When the advisor came back to ask about it, he would think about it. As soon as he entered the room, Park SeoJoon immediately discovered him and went up. The call, Mr. SeoJoon, he immediately replied, "It's me." She immediately said, right at that moment, when he opened the door, his mind was still in the previous conversation with the counselor and didn't pay attention to whether there was anyone else in the room besides her or not. It turned out that 3 representatives of the top 3 academies were standing next to SeoJoon. He looked at them and asked, "Who are these people?" She immediately reached out to them and introduced him. These were representatives of Hunter Mill Academy, Ale, and Jian. The 3 people introduced were Jinhyun and Hyein, who looked at him happily, and Jinsung had a slightly pale face, frowning a bit and exhaling a long breath. They then each took turns introducing themselves. Jinhyun spoke first. "Nice to meet you. I am the representative for Hunter Mill Academy." Jinhyun so, Hyein were next to me smiling and introducing. "Hello, I Hunter Ale Academy representative, Hyein Cha." As for Jinsung, he crossed his arms and closed his eyes, not looking at him, not saying hello, but only introducing his name, "I'm Jinsung Lee." After hearing their greetings and introductions, he was puzzled and asked again, what was the representative of the top 3 academy doing here? After a while of telling the story, he immediately asked again, "What about an exchange tournament?" Jinhyun replied, "Yes, it is usually an unofficial tournament between the 3 academies Hunter Mill, Ale and Gown, but if there are also Dream Academies participating, then he will have to raise his level to participate. Join our exchange tournament." Hyein stood next to him and added, hoping that the Dream Academy and SeoJoon would be able to participate in the exchange tournament and shine. He heard the 2 of them talking and raised his hand to rub his chin and let out a hum. Then he looked at her. She immediately noticed and said, "Don't worry about me, please accept to join if you feel comfortable." When he heard that, his bright eyes turned to look at the other 3 people and eagerly asked, "What about the reward?" Jinhyun replied, "There is no reward." He was in a state of excitement. Hearing him say that, he immediately lost interest. His eyes looked at him with dull disbelief, making it difficult for him to understand what was going on. Then he scratched his head and looked at them and asked, "Is there no prize?" Hyein immediately replied, "It's just an exchange tournament. The only purpose is to compete with other geniuses to improve each person's skills." Then he turned to look at SeoJoon and asked, "SeoJoon, after all, my participation will be beneficial to the Dream Academy, right?" She immediately replied, "No, it doesn't have to be like that." Because the exchange tournament was an unofficial tournament, it didn't matter whether he participated or not. When he heard that, his face immediately became depressed and he didn't say anything. In the surprise of everyone there, he decisively turned away and left only one sentence, "That's it, I won't participate." Jinsung stood there without saying anything, then stammered dumbfoundedly, You, and Hyein was so confused that he spoke loudly, "That's where you can compete with geniuses like you, Sion. What you're saying is, are you going to refuse this opportunity?" He didn't pay attention, waved his hand and said, "So what, if I win I won't get anything?" Hyein still persisted in persuading, "But please think again," he thought helplessly, so persistent. At this moment, he suddenly discovered Minhyul running by and called out, "Hey Minhyul." He heard me calling and immediately turned around and replied, "Yes." After his call, he also stopped. He immediately walked up to him and said as he walked, "By the way, are you planning to participate in the exchange tournament?" He immediately replied, "Exchange tournament, honey, why not me, Captain?" He scratched his neck, his face helplessly breathing softly as he said, "I'm busy with a few things, so it will be a bit difficult to arrange time." He heard that and said, "Really? Well, I don't really care about those things." This. Then he raised his hand to rub his chin, closed his eyes thoughtfully and said, Should I go? I also want to try out the new skill I just learned. I want to try it with the captain, but obviously I can't, Dad." When the representative of the top 3 schools saw him pushing this issue on Minhyul, his face was black and his mouth was open, not knowing what to say. After receiving a suitable answer, he coldly turned around, waved his hand and said, "Good, then decide. Minul will go for me, then 20,000. If you explain a little, 20,000. Thousand sounds similar to Lehman. In Korean, it also means see you later." The three people behind were really panicking at this point. Jinhyun immediately reached towards him, opened his mouth and shouted, "No, no wait." Hyein shouted one after another, "Please wait." Jinsung did the same, he could only helplessly scream the two words wait. What followed was their calls to him, "Mr. SeoJoon Kim, hey SeoJoon Kim." The three representatives of the top 3 academy were huddled together, their faces looking very helpless. Jinsung said, "How to handle this situation?" The other two were silent, not knowing how to respond. What words? A few minutes ago, when SeoJoon was really not interested in participating in the exchange, the top 3 academy representatives looked at him at the same time and said, "So what do you want?" He immediately shouted at them, "If I win, the bonus must also be 6 billion. The 3 of them were now sadly discussing his request. Jinhyun spoke up, 6 billion. Jinsung replied, who knew he was so passionate about money. Hyein said, "So his condition is that the lowest prize must be 6 billion won, then he will participate." Jinsung replied, "If Kim SeoJoon does not participate, then what is the meaning of this friendly tournament? No, we originally organized the tournament to win against Kim SeoJoon." When she heard him say that, she crossed her arms and sighed, knowing that it was like that, but she wanted a reward for just a friendly match, which was really nonsense. When the 3 of them were both angry and helpless because of his conditions, Minul stood right there and also helplessly said loudly, "Captain, why do you need so much money?" He stood there with his back turned. Everyone, with expressionless faces, tears streaming down their eyes, said tremblingly, "I think I'm about to go crazy because of this money thing." At this moment, Jinhyun immediately put his hand to his mouth and pretended to cough to attract everyone's attention. Ahem. Then he spoke up and said sorry for talking for so long. Everyone who heard that all looked towards him. He immediately asked, "It seemed like everyone had some sort of conflict, is it okay?" He took a few steps forward and faced him and said, "This problem is not so big that you have to worry. Not so heroic. To be honest, we really want to interact with you, Mr. SeoJoon Kim. We really hope that our students will have the opportunity to rub shoulders with Mr. SeoJoon to suppress their arrogance and improve their skills. His abilities. But you said that if there was no reward, you wouldn't participate." We had no other choice but to consider this offer, and that's it. Finally, we decided to set a reward. He heard that and immediately spoke up, but before he could finish his sentence, he immediately raised his hand to stop what he said. However, in return, there will be some conditions. When he said this sentence, both his and Hyein's faces were smiling happily, and Jinsung still had that dislike attitude but a little lighter than before. Ignoring the conditions as well as the prize for the exchange, right now Suyin is in the process of practicing her strength. She closes her eyes and raises her arms forward, creating a stream of energy running around. Cover your body. When she had accumulated enough energy, she swung her arms strongly to the sides, causing that stream of power to spread out around her, creating quite a large commotion. After releasing the energy, she immediately opened her eyes and the Dharma saint appeared and said kindly, "Compress your mana a little more." Hearing that, she immediately replied, "Yes." As for Minul, he is also practicing his strength. His strength is flash running. He stood next to everyone practicing and exclaimed, "Wow." Then he spoke up and said, "Everyone is practicing hard." He stood there tapping his foot and said in his head, "The reward was set at 6 billion won according to my original proposal. In addition, there will be other rewards of 4 billion won for the second place winner, and 2 billion won for the third place winner, so the total reward is 12 billion won. The fighting method will be team fighting, which is duel, so if I win I can take all the other 6 billion won." He raised one finger to lightly tap his mouth, the other hand put it in his pocket, looked up at the process of the two practicing and thought, that part is not worth mentioning, but... He then remembered the conversation he had just had with the 3 academy representatives, remembering when Jinhyun said, "But in exchange there would be some conditions. If we were the only ones deciding on the reward, wouldn't it be a bit unfair? So, we will be the ones who decide on the method and rules of the competition." When I heard him say that, I immediately thought, well, they give prizes so they also have that right. He continued, "And we also asked everyone from the Dream Academy to also participate in this tournament." Minul stood behind him, placing her hands behind her head, listening to the conditions he said, then spoke up, "Then like I said before, whatever." Suyin also stood right there and spoke after him. Me too, I've been practicing very hard lately and really want to know my level. What level is my body at?" When he heard the two of them speak, he turned his head to look at the two and smiled slightly. He then turned back to look at him and asked if there were any other conditions. He immediately replied, yes, however. Looks like there's one person who still doesn't agree. When he, Minhyul and Suyin heard that, they looked at him in confusion. Then he wondered in his head, what did he say? Besides the three of us, there were no other students in this dream. Thinking of this, he turned his head to look at SeoJoon, screaming in his head, no way. Both Minhyul and Suyin followed suit and turned their heads to look at her. When she saw everyone looking at her, she was confused and raised her hand to point at her and asked, what, me too? And that's right, in that exchange, besides him, Suyin and Minhyul, there was also her, and right now she was also at his place practicing with Minhyul and Suyin. Her skill was using the sword. He was still standing there watching her practice. He looked at her and wondered in his mind, if this was a duel tournament, why did they even want to force Ms. SeoJoon to participate? Then he suddenly called out to her, Ms. SeoJoon. She was practicing to hear him call, so she stopped, turned her head to look at him and replied, what's wrong? He walked towards her and scratched his head and said, if you're doing all of this for me, then there's no need to force yourself to do anything. She heard that and immediately raised her hand to stop him. Not. Until now, I've always been helped by you, but I've never done anything for you. At least I have to repay the favor once. He heard that and immediately objected. What are you talking about? Your help for me, it's already a lot more than I need. She then raised her hand to push him. She pushed his back to let him walk forward and said, I'm fine, you don't need to worry too much. He was pushed away by her and immediately tried to turn around and said worriedly, wait, Miss SeoJoon. Then she breathed out, closed her eyes, said seriously, Mr. SeoJoon, you don't need to worry about me, just go do what you need to do. He was powerless to resist and didn't know what to say. As he walked, he rubbed the back of his neck and thought, well, it's true that I have a few things to prepare for this tournament. She was behind him, her back turned to him, her hands covering her chest, her face sad. He didn't think about the previous problem anymore but had already moved on to another question in his mind, but now he remembered, why did the advisor say he would leave early but he never said a word? Just mentioning nonsense is nonsense. As soon as he took it off, his phone suddenly rang. He took out his phone to look and saw a notification, SeoJoon, please don't take the Manhwa course for the time being. He read it and was confused for a moment. He asked, temporarily stopping the Manhwa course. The virtual advisor immediately replied, this is a bit complicated and can't be explained completely, but, to make it more clear, I just sent the operator a review request. I'll be right back when they reply. He frowned slightly and then asked, what happened? He immediately thought to himself, well, let's just take the courses I currently have to improve my progress. A few days later. The morning of the friendly tournament. All 4 people of the Dream Academy were now present at the competition venue. All 4 people's faces showed confusion. Minhyul even exclaimed, wow. He suddenly spoke up, they said this was just an unofficial competition and yet they made a venue as big as a battlefield. I have a feeling this might not be just a normal friendly tournament. She immediately replied, the top 3 academy is not naturally called that. He immediately said, I understand, while he and she were talking about the issue of the competition venue. Behind the two of them, Minhyul he still using his hand to block the sun, he looked around and asked if they sold rice cakes. Suyin was right there, hearing him say that and dumbfoundedly asked, rice, what? At this time, are you still thinking about eating? He immediately replied, there's nothing you can't eat. While the 4 were going inside, he noticed a group of people who looked like reporters walking towards them. He pointed at them and asked, are those people over there journalists? She looked and replied, probably so. It seemed like this time they were going to make a big splash in the newspapers. When he heard that, he didn't say anything and just hummed. Then she didn't care about those people anymore and flipped through the documents in her hand and said that the first round of the tournament was a qualifying match between students from different schools. Minhyul and Suyin, who were joking with each other, were startled when they heard that. The two then turned around to do something. Seeing that, she and he looked at the two in confusion. Minhyul immediately spoke up, please let me fight the last captain, please let me fight Suyin first. Suyin continued, me too, SeoJoon and Minhyul, please, but before he could finish his sentence he shouted, what did you just say? It turns out that the two of them turned around to pray for themselves. When he and she heard and saw that, they immediately looked at the two of them helplessly. Minhyul spoke again, please ignore it, yesterday I peeked at the captain's training session. I was going crazy looking at it. How the hell is a spear? When he heard this his face was like, oh what's wrong? Did he sneak a peek at his own move? It seems like he had already seen that move of Chi Tian Dai Tan. Suyin heard that and shouted angrily, knowing it was like that, but why did you say that about me? When he saw her angry like that, he hesitantly said, well, While the four were chatting amongst themselves, on the other side of the group of journalists, they seemed to have discovered something and turned their heads in the same direction. One of them also shouted loudly. On the other side was Haeun Lee. He heard the scream and turned around to look inexplicably. At the place where the exchange of power took place, Lee Haeun was being escorted by many bodyguards, surrounded by flashing lights and the screams of those present. The group of journalists right there immediately gathered around. Someone said loudly, "I am a reporter for Hanpong Daily. Can I have a moment? Miss Haeun, please look over here, please. Do you know the reason why this friendly tournament was partially publicized? Would she participate in the fight, or would she just stand outside and watch the fight?" She didn't care about those questions. She just walked straight inside, and a manager immediately came out and held out his hand to lead her. "Go tell me, please come this way." Then when she was about to go inside, someone said it out loud. There were many rumors that she didn't participate in the friendly tournament because of SeoJoon Kim. I don't know if it's true or not, she heard, then immediately stopped. The surrounding atmosphere suddenly became gloomy after the reporter's question, and he immediately cried out in panic. He said with a scared face, "No, I didn't mean it," and she turned her head to look at him. Then he asked, "Who is SeoJoon Kim?" The journalist who had just asked the previous question heard this and sat down in fright. The journalists standing behind him were dumbfounded and didn't know what to say. After she responded with a question, she immediately turned around and left. As for the four of us, all four had been observing the noise over there. Minhyul immediately spoke up, so that was the famous hunter Lee Haeun, had only heard of it before. Then he said with a fascinated face, "She's really pretty." Suyin stood right there and heard that and glanced at him with a dark face. Then she was annoyed and asked him, why did he suddenly say that? He replied, "Because she's pretty. Is it wrong to praise a pretty person?" SeoJoon looked at the two and covered her mouth and said, "Oh my god." He was standing there with a blank face, not understanding what was going on. Suyin immediately said again, "Because it didn't fit the context, and besides, you've never said I'm pretty once." He pouted and replied, "You're still in high school, you should ask right away, please. What does high school have to do with each other?" He immediately wiggled his ears, saying every word to tease her. Of course, it had to do with it. She was so angry that he was teasing her like that. She then immediately used her internal energy to scream loudly, "Ah, I told you not to tease me anymore." Her scream was said to be a vibration in the sky. Everyone present on the field at this time was because her scream stopped all activities. And then everyone noticed us guys. They took turns saying, "Ha, is that SeoJoon Kim? SeoJoon Kim, what is he doing here? No, it can't be. Don't tell me Dream Academy also participated in this tournament." After screaming loudly, her whole face turned red because everyone was paying attention to her. SeoJoon and Minhyul also looked at them, chatting and gawking. And at this moment, the camera lenses and flashlights all pointed at us. Someone among the journalists added, "So that's why part of the tournament will be public." Next were the reporter's constant questions for you. "Mr. SeoJoon, can I talk to you? Are you planning to fight Lee Haeun in this tournament?" Minhyul once again crossed her arms. Her bright face let out a loud cry, then she looked at Suyin and said, "Well done." She suddenly replied, "It was because of SeoJoon." As for him, when he saw those journalists asking him the above questions, he could only smile wryly and say nothing. Then he boldly walked in and said, "Let's go in." SeoJoon covered her mouth and smiled. Minhyul laughed and teased Suyin in the back, KKKK, and Suyin was being teased but couldn't do anything but gritted his teeth and looked at him angrily. In the Dream Academy waiting room, the manager there repeatedly, as I said, used personal equipment that is absolutely prohibited in this tournament. Mr. SeoJoon Kim's Gauss, Miss SeoJoon Park's sword, Mr. Minhyul Lee's dual swords and bow are enough. Ms. Suyin Sok, do you need any more equipment? She happily replied, "Ah, I'm fine." Minhyul held the bow in one hand, the other hand rubbed her chin thoughtfully and said, The quality is not bad, but the problem is that I'm not used to using this." SeoJoon was right there smiling and saying, "Yeah, I also think so." Suyin stood nearby, his face bright and said, "Only a bad craftsman would blame his weapon." Minhyul heard that and immediately twisted his face and said again, "That's a lie. Have you ever seen a worker who uses bad tools and doesn't like it? Those workers only say that because they already use good tools." She looked at him and replied, "I know, I was just kidding." He immediately shouted, "You're joking with me like that because you're the only one who doesn't need to use a weapon, right?" She smirked and shouted back, "It was revenge for what happened just now." Then Minhyul turned to him and asked, "Never mind, Captain, how do you see that?" He heard that and replied, "Me, yeah, I see." Minhyul turned Suyin's face and said, "What? It seems like the captain doesn't care much." Suyin also did not give up. She also raised her hand to turn his face and smiled and said, "It seems SeoJoon is not picky about his dancing. Some of my own." He immediately answered, "Actually no, that's not exactly what I meant." Then seeing that he and she didn't pay attention to him but instead were fighting each other, he helplessly said, "Do you guys even want to listen?" He didn't pay attention to the two of them anymore, holding the spear in his hand, rubbing the back of his neck, slightly lowering his head to look at the spear in his hand, thinking, I don't know if it's okay to just use this. And during the time of preparation and testing of new weapons, the exchange battle has already begun. A young man with a slightly uncomfortable face tilted his head and said nothing. It turned out that person was the person who would compete with him in the first round. He looked at him and thought, who is that person that they had to introduce a rule banning personal equipment? Standing between him and him was the match referee. The referee is explaining the content of the fight to two people. Both of them know the rules, right? He stood there talking in his head, more. Then remembering his conversation with Jiang Siwan said, "I don't plan to participate in the tournament this time." He immediately asked, why? Because he heard rumors that Li Heiyun was also participating. It seems that in this world, even Siwan Jiang is afraid of Li Heiyun. Siwan replied, "That's not the case." Hearing that, he immediately asked again, "So why exactly?" Siwan frowned slightly, sweating coldly and said nothing. It took a while for Siwan to answer, "It's because SeoJoon Kim will participate." Back to the present, he was standing there with both hands holding the spear, looking bewildered. He gritted his teeth and frowned at him. He shouted in his head, that idiot. Siwan Jiang stepped back because he was afraid of this person, then regained his composure and thought, "Never mind, I will take this opportunity and show you, who is the real one." Super Rookie. At that moment the referee spoke up, both of them were ready. Then the referee raised his hand and said, "So. Begin." As soon as the referee finished speaking, he jumped up and quickly ran away from where he was standing. The other guy was slightly startled without being prepared. Then his whole face frowned tightly, his face dark and unbelievable. He then immediately looked around looking for him, in his mind saying, "I've lost track of him." Suddenly he felt something flying quickly behind him and turned his head to look. He shouted in his head, there was danger, and at the same time, his spear slashed hard at him, but he quickly used his sword to block his sudden attack. But even though he blocked that attack, he still cried out in panic, "Cuke." He looked at him standing in front of him, both hands holding the spear in preparation to stab hard at him, and shouted in his head, "What power is this?" And then his spear also hit him. He was hit by a strong blow and was unbelievably bleeding. Then he swung his hand and hit him again, sending him flying away. However, he was still able to stand firm and not fall down after his attack, but his body showed signs of slight trembling. But before he could calm down, he quickly rushed in front of him. Then he stabbed the spear forcefully at him, causing him to stand motionless and let out a loud gasp. He looked at the spear tip that was flying quickly and was about to pierce his eye when he was so scared that he shouted loudly, "No, no." But the spear tip didn't completely pierce his eye, it stopped in front of his eyes only 5 centimeters away. The two of them somehow stood motionless. He was holding a spear pointing at him, and he was standing on his haunches looking straight at him. Then, right at the tip of the spear, a stream of energy emitted, hitting the surroundings. The people present were silent and said nothing. He was shaking so much that he had difficulty breathing, let alone speaking. He couldn't even hold the sword firmly, causing the sword to fall out of his hand. He were still standing in that position, and the referee's voice immediately rang out, but in that voice mixed with disbelief, making the voice loud but stuttering, SeoJoon Kim, win." He stood there in fear and cold sweat. He suddenly looked at his tattered spear and was startled. He trembled and wondered in his head, was that crack on his spear? He pulled out his spear and looked at it and said, he immediately knew it would be like that, it's really uncomfortable. Then he sighed and frowned, saying that if he had ended the match just 1 second later, the spear would have broken into pieces. Seeing that, he was so scared that he turned pale and sat down on the ground, trembling. He then raised his spear and said loudly, "Hey, can anyone give me a harder spear?" I couldn't use my full strength because I was afraid the spear would break, and he sat there. He could only smile wryly to cure his panic, ha ha ha, and someone from the management board came over to help him up. A raised arm holding a spear obscured the glare from the ceiling, and a sigh, hum. It turned out that the arm belonged to SeoJoon. He looked at the newly replaced spear and thought helplessly, as he thought, it couldn't stand it. To be honest, from the first time I touched this spear, I felt a bit uneasy, but I didn't expect that after swinging it 3 times, it cracked. He thought about when he first received the spear, when Minyul and Suyin were when they fought. He stood right there, rubbing his chin and looking at the spear, saying, It was really worrying. Then when it was time to fight with the guy, the spear actually cracked. He opened his mouth and looked at it helplessly and said, "I knew it right away." The other guy was trembling looking at him and that cracked spear. Now he suddenly let out a long sigh, and thought, if this keeps up, I'll have to replace the spear with a new one after every round. While he was helpless with his weapon, he suddenly felt two people's sparkling eyes staring at him, causing him to sweat even though he was closing his eyes and sighing helplessly. Those two eyes were from Minhyul and SeoJoon. They really loved him to death, and now they admired him even more. Then Minhyul immediately exclaimed and asked him, "Wow, big brother, so what you showed during practice isn't everything?" He was sitting on the chair with his arms crossed when he heard that and opened his eyes to see him, and SeoJoon standing next to him also added, "Everyone is crazy about what you just showed." SeoJoon, standing nearby, also smiled and brought her phone screen to him and said, "There's also an article about you." He immediately asked in confusion, "What, newspaper?" Then he took her phone and read the article. On the article it was written, 20 daily, Dream Academy participated in the friendly tournament of Hunter Mills, Ale, and Jane. Kim SeoJoon faced Lee Hae-eun. Who will be the winner? He looked at the article and thought, there really is this article? SeoJoon said, I think the reporters we saw at the entrance wrote it. He looked at her and said, the feedback section under the post was crazy. It was even in the search suggestions section. She stood opposite him and crossed her arms and said, more importantly, the top 3 guilds will pay all the expenses incurred during the friendly tournament. They just wanted to attract your attention. He heard her say that and immediately opened his eyes wide and exclaimed, wow, Lee Hae-eun is really great, right? Minhyul stood right behind and clenched his fists, his eyes bulging with blood and shouted, no, big brother, Lee Hae-eun is what's great, you're great. Hearing that, he stupidly turned around and looked at him, but he still pouted and said, who is Lee Hae-eun that can be compared to big brother? When she heard that, she covered her mouth and smiled softly and said, you're right Minhyul, this is all because SeoJoon is really impressive. Whether internally or externally, people always imagine Lee Hae-eun as an insurmountable wall, so everyone will definitely go crazy because SeoJoon is gradually breaking that wall, as well as SeoJoon. He quickly took out his phone and said, yes, everyone is going crazy and calling him an extraordinary superhero. Minhyul put her hands behind her head and pursed her lips as she said, if I had to choose between Big Brother and Hae-eun as my next opponent, I would not hesitate to choose Lee Hae-eun right away, SeoJoon continued, and I would choose Minhyul. When he heard that, he asked in confusion, why did he suddenly drag him in? And when he heard the two of them talking, he immediately laughed, ha ha ha. As for Lee Hae-eun, she seems to be somewhere else right now, her face expressionless. Jinhyun stood in front of her, turned his back to her and asked, how is it? She immediately replied, there must be a reason why his name is mentioned so much. He asked her again, do you think you can defeat Kim SeoJoon? Hearing that, she moved her mouth a little. He didn't wait for her to answer and spoke up, don't take the matter too seriously, if you don't win then you can get second place. Before she could finish her sentence, she spoke up, CEO. No matter how hard he tried to struggle, after all, wasn't he just extraordinary at the level of a practitioner? Hearing that, he immediately sat up straight and glanced back. He replied, indeed, then don't pay any attention to my worries, listen to me, nodding with his hands behind his back. She then walked out of the room, leaving only him sitting there. He was still in a state of glancing at her. Then suddenly he turned his eyes back down, revealing slight worry in them. It turned out that he was looking down at the arena, where he was holding a crossbow in his hand and facing a person from the tournament management committee who was bowing before him. The conversation between him and the manager was about his broken spear. He helplessly pointed at the spear and said, it was broken. The manager was equally helpless because he had changed the spears before. Already. He was above looking down at him, his face suddenly became worried and said, worried. The tournament and the search for a champion continues. As expected, Minhyul climbed up the rankings. Minhyul had just defeated an opponent and raised both hands holding his sword high, howling in celebration, buying ha ha. And even though I thought SeoJoon would struggle, she fought really well. The referee announced the winner, SeoJoon Sok, and although she was quite tired from the recent fight, when she won, she still smiled brightly in celebration. And the referee's voice rang out again, but this time louder and clearer, Kim SeoJoon won, and he eliminated another opponent. And like the previous battles, after the end, it was time for him to say loudly to the management, excuse me, can you replace me with a new spear? The manager heard him and couldn't believe it. Stammering, it's broken again. He then scratched his head and smiled wryly, then said, I tried to control my strength but, my opponents were all extraordinary cadets, so it was much harder than I thought. The other people in the management team talked among themselves. One asked, How many weapons had he replaced so far? The other covered his mouth and replied softly, including this one, there were 9. The other person couldn't believe it when he heard that and thought, 9, the price of one weapon must be tens of millions of won, so the total cost to replace all those weapons, the cost must exceed 1 billion. If that's the case, then the cost of weapons will exceed the prize money. This situation is like the belly button is bigger than the belly. But we can't refuse to replace a completely broken weapon like this. When the management department brought the broken spear in for exchange, he immediately raised his hand and said sorry. If it keeps going like this, wouldn't it be better for me to use my own spear? He looked at the management team scratching their head and said, both of them who were about to take the spear to exchange heard him say that and were startled. He continued, in a situation like this, it doesn't count as special treatment, but rather flexible response, whether the organizers plan to change the competition rules or not. A person in the management board quickly turned around and ran loudly, saying, I will go and ask. He didn't pay much attention to this, so he walked towards his teammates, thinking, well, they will probably find a solution. Then suddenly he discovered that SeoJoon seemed a bit strange, and immediately huffed, and walked closer to her. As for SeoJoon, her hands seemed to be shaking a bit. He immediately asked, SeoJoon, is the next match yours? She heard him ask and immediately looked up at him, huffing, then replied, yes, her face clearly showed concern. He saw her trembling so violently, so he panicked and walked closer to ask, why are you trembling like that? Your face is also pale. She stood there trembling for a while before slowly speaking, it was because your next opponent is Lee Hae-eun. When I heard her say that, my face darkened and I looked at her. He looked at her trembling all over, emitting a gloomy aura around her and thought, now I understand her reaction. SeoJoon must have been under a lot of pressure, she hadn't been studying the Holy Dharma for long. She nervously bowed her head and asked him if she could do well. He immediately smiled and comforted her, it wasn't like she was preparing to raid a dungeon or anything. Win or lose is not important, so don't be too tense, competition is a good thing, but letting it haunt you is not good. She heard his advice and immediately spoke up, but then she worriedly thought to herself, the last raid wasn't much help. She remembered the glorious battle before and sighed in her heart, the feeling of accomplishing something together. Known to everyone. And the feeling of success after improving my abilities. The whole process was really comfortable. So, that's the reason. But I can feel the distance more clearly than anyone else. At this point, she clenched her fists, determined to think, I have to show that I can do something too. That I deserve to be with you guys, and at this moment suddenly the referee announced, Student of Dream Academy SeoJoon Sok, when you are ready, please take your position. He and she were both startled. Slightly because of the above announcement. He immediately turned towards her, raised his index finger and smiled, wishing her luck. She had now regained her original confidence, even though she was still a little nervous, but her determined eyes could not be hidden. She clenched her fists and looked at him and said loudly, yes. She turned around and ran to the fighting position, determined to think, I want to test my own worth. When she reached her position, she immediately hugged her chest, her body relaxed, closed her eyes, bowed her head and breathed a light sigh, and in front of her, a figure appeared. When she calmed down, she looked up and was slightly startled by the person standing opposite her. And that person is none other than Hae-eun, the person who will fight her in this match. She comes from the opposite side, walking towards her with an evil spirit. Looking at her expressionless face makes her hair tremble. Nape. When both of them had stabilized their positions, the referee immediately coughed, asking if they were both ready. So let's begin. As soon as the referee finished speaking, she quickly retreated back. His whole body took a defensive stance, dispersing his own energy and staring at her. But she still stood there without moving at all. Then suddenly she spoke up, try it. She didn't understand and asked again, what? She stood there, arms crossed, her eyes scary as she said, trying to get away with everything she could. Lee Hae-eun's voice was serious as he told SeoJoon, just try everything you can. She didn't understand the question. What she meant was, she held her sword and told her, that way, she would realize how insignificant she was. Having finished speaking, she quickly drew her sword without a single unnecessary move. She looked at SeoJoon disdainfully. As for her question, she just replied, leaving SeoJoon with a bewildered look on her face, so do your best. SeoJoon now observed her posture, her weapon was touching the floor and she was not in a fighting position yet. Feeling that the other person did not value him, SeoJoon got angry and gritted his teeth. SeoJoon took a fighting stance, lightning also appeared, she said loudly, I will make you regret the words you just said. She sighed and looked at her hand, feeling ridiculous at her words. Why does everyone say such boring things? At this time, Suyin was performing magic. A stream of blue light surrounds her and radiates around. The fear move. Fear is magic that creates a thick shield and puts pressure on the opponent. She gathered the force of lightning into her fist and looked towards Haeun to lock the target. Immediately jumped to her place while Haeun remained standing in the same place. Hyein Cha stood up and gasped. Jin Hyun So sat next to him, watching the match intently, with an equally surprised look on his face. She found it hard to believe that while she was worried about Suyin, a magician would engage in close combat. Haeun looked coldly at Suyin rushing towards him, with an opponent like Lee Haeun. Suyin rushed forward but Haeun dodged the attack much faster than her fist. Clearly the two had a difference in strength. Suyin looked up to see the formation and she noticed it by looking back. Immediately, the formation that had been set up sent down terrible lightning, and the two continued to fight. The two of them watched from afar and praised Suyin's agility. Even though she was only a student, she was capable of performing magic and unpredictable movements. Haein was clearly praising but her voice sounded a bit disappointed. My self-esteem was hurt, but I can understand why our academy is having such difficulties. She continued, normally the role of a magician in a team is to just stand back and perform magic. She asked the question, but could a real battle really take place like that? In her mind, thousands of questions were now unfavorable to the mage. What if the mana was in chaos? What if the magician was in a state of limited mana? What would happen if there was a mana explosion? And the world has no more mana. What will happen if there aren't any hunters to protect the mage? In fact, the situation can change at any time, if the mage only focuses on casting magic. However, after holy magic, that method of fighting almost disappeared. SeoJoon and Minhyul were also in the private room watching the match. He shouted, "Yeah, Suyin, apply more pressure." SeoJoon standing in a corner was also wondering about the magic saint's moves. At the peak of magicians in the era of Cataclysm, this was the fighting method that the magic saint used. At the beginning of the Great Flood era, the Dharma saint was known as a disaster. With that in mind, other countries called the Dharma saint, who when appearing in public creates terrible energy, as war magician. Suyin raised his fist and shouted loudly, rushing towards Haeun. Seeing her dodge the attack, her expression was surprised. Suddenly she spoke up, "Is that all you have?" She swung her sword while she was still struggling. Then she punched her right in the stomach. This light move released a strong force into the air. Suyin vomited blood immediately afterward. She trembled and clung to her. Haeun looked at her and asked, "Do you understand now?" Suyin bowed his head and said, I've been fooled." She glanced down and suddenly replied, "What?" Then lightning appeared surrounding Suyin. Explodes rocks. Realizing she had been tricked, her expression changed angrily as she looked at her. Suyin looked up with an incredulous face. "I only intended to slightly injure her, but in reality there wasn't even a scratch." While she was thinking, "I didn't think there was such a big difference between the two," when a hand waved strongly. "Slap her away." Suyin's lifeless eyes looked at her. Looking at her blankly, "Ha." Seconds later, he was thrown far away. Hyein Cha saw this scene and immediately sat down and sighed. SeoJoon and Minhyul were pale and panicked. SeoJoon was also heartbroken when he saw her injured. Haeun took back his sword and glared at her, while Suyin lay on the ground trembling. She pulled up Suyin's shirt, even though she was breathing rapidly. His face turned unpleasant as he looked at her raising her hand. A loud pop echoed throughout the room.